5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Art of Move with myself, Anthony Manuele, my good friend, Dr. William Rajbar. I am back in the Canadian Rockies. This is my first episode back after being away in Mexico for a month. Will's been in Banff the whole time, and we're back in Canada together, here to provide the grand unified theory, or attempt to provide the grand unified theory of human movement and biomechanics efficient training. You know the drill at this point. We're 53 episodes deep. And I'm pretty excited for today's episode. It's a really interesting topic to me. Will and I were having a discussion over Messenger talking about, hey, what do you think is more effective or efficient or, even useful, training patterns directly and taking the SAID principle, specific adaptations, to impose demands to the extreme, and only training the behaviors and the patterns that you want to become more efficient at? Or is it useful to use external implements, tools, and training objects, training resistance or sort of balance tools, etc., to provide a training stimulus, a training effect that will make your body adapt to certain stimuli? And we're not necessarily talking about dumbbells or barbells, because we've kind of talked about how resistance training and strength training, lifting, for example, can negatively impact the neurological inputs of your gait cycles. So an easy example that we could go to is how, when you're doing a bilateral squat, like a squat with a barbell on your back, that bilateral movement has different lever mechanics and different tissue length mechanics than when you're running contralaterally, right? And so that's an easy example of how an external training object, because you're training your lower body, quote unquote, with a squat, it doesn't mean that your lower body will be better adapted to having a better stride or more power in your run necessarily. However, does that apply universally? Are there actual tools that can make your movements more efficient? Is there a way to make your movement more efficient than what, quote, natural patterns is? Is there like a supernatural version of human movement efficiency that we haven't accessed yet? And I think that's sort of the conversation that we're going to have. I wanted to kind of explore different training implements that David Weck has invented, that Naudi Aguilar has invented, some other functional fitness stuff that we see pretty regularly used, things like maces and clubs, etc. But just off the top of your head, do you have a general stance on this topic, or are you kind of more agnostic and looking to explore it through conversation today?
Yeah, I'm looking to explore it, but in general, I look at each tool as something different, right? It's just a tool that you're bringing to the game. The purists on one side will be like, we only work with our body and put in the patterns, right? Or some of them actually do the opposite and say, let's work on just the parts and then put it, and say, don't even put it into a pattern, right? So I would call that more of a pure mindset, stay in the patterns or only do the exercise. And then there's another field where purist on the other side, you're doing mace bells all the time. You're trying to swing implements. You're trying to use tools to enhance your performance, right? Or enhance your gait cycle. So I'm somewhere in the middle. I say each tool does something different. It depends on your intention. There's the word intention again, right? And yeah, I'd like to get into the nuances of kind of like what each tool is for and how to think about it, and maybe how you can implement it in movement.
Yeah, and we are going to have David Weck on this Thursday as well to talk about his different inventions and talk about how he actually implements them and how he thinks they create a training effect. So I don't want to get too, we can speculate a little bit, but it'll be cool to actually talk to him about some of the actual intentions of why he invented some of these things. When I think of someone using an implement like a mace, for example, or let's even say the Indian club, right? In the functional movement space, you're not training to swing a club better, right? Like, the point of swinging a club is not to become more efficient at swinging a club. It is to create the sort of sling dynamics that you would experience when you're throwing something, right? So our shoulder has this connected slinging action, this swing, this rotation of the shoulder that happens when you're throwing an object forward. You can emulate that connectivity and that sequencing very, very effectively using an external object like a club, for example. And in that sense, it's like, that's kind of more efficient, I guess, than picking up a rock and throwing it and then chasing the rock and throwing it over and over and over just to get better at your throw. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I do think actually there's a bigger community that does just do it to swing, right? To get better at swinging.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who are doing flow with the mace that doesn't exactly have to do with the sling systems. So I'd say it's actually on the other side. But in our micro niche, you're correct. I think it's using an implement to be able to do thousands of reps over and over and over again. For me, in a throwing pattern, why not do it like that, right? It's not the first place I'd go though.
No.
That's really what it's about. It's what is the priority in training, right? Because basically we can argue over whether to put patterns into things or to train patterns, but everybody agrees you should train parts as well. Like you should be able to train the hip to be able to be in motion or stable or create a bow in terms of Goda, right? So, or at least to have range of motion. So it really is about priorities as well. What do we train first?
Yeah, and I guess when we're defining what our movement priorities are, we want to have efficiency in the gait cycle. We want to be able to have, structural integrity enough that we can throw things. I like having enough structural integrity and upper body strength that I can do. Like if I wanted to climb a tree, I should be able to do that. In my opinion, I should be able to jump, grab a branch, hoist myself up. Not necessarily do like dozens of pull-ups, but if I wanted to pull myself up enough that I could like get over a branch, that's sort of like, to me, I think in terms of what's the minimal amount of strength that I need to move around and navigate my environment. And I try to think in terms of like, okay, if I'm on the African savannah and I'm trying to hunt an animal, or I'm trying to find food, from an ancestral perspective, what's a human being trying to do? Well, when you're looking for honey, climbing a tree to smoke out a bunch of bees is something that you're gonna want to be able to do. If you're hunting an animal, you want to be able to throw either a spear, or you want to be able to throw heavy rocks, and you want to be able to like blunt this animal down with something. And as far as how much are you lifting, well, you pick up this animal once, hoist it over your shoulder, maybe you and a friend do that, and then you're carrying something, and you're stabilizing something over your shoulder. Maybe you switch shoulders once in a while. That's the extent of like when I think of like what are native human functions. It's the stand, walk, run, throw, and then I also have climb and hang in there as like not secondary but tertiary functions of that human beings should at least be able to do. So in terms of that, that's kind of what I'm looking to optimize, right? And so one point that Ido Portal made like ages ago that has really stuck with me. It actually is the reason that I moved away from powerlifting at the time, like years and years ago, was he said, the more that you specialize in any movement practice, the bigger price you pay in terms of your capacity to do other things. And I really, really believe that, right? So, when you're like the question that you asked is like, why wouldn't you use like an Indian club to optimize for throwing? Well, my question is, are the actual mechanics of swinging a club going to emulate the force curve of how you release an object when you're throwing it? Like you can decelerate the club to stop as that club passes that point where it becomes weightless, right? And you have that point of weightlessness, but you can't like, if you huck a club really, really hard, you either have to follow the trajectory, the arc that it's going in, and redirect that energy somewhere else, or it's going to freaking fly off and hit you or someone else, right? So whereas when you're throwing an object, you huck it back and you throw it and you release it, and you're not trying to redirect that circular energy, other than your hand releases and then you kind of have to do something with it. But I don't think necessarily that an Indian club is going to perfectly emulate. It might create some structural stability and some integration of that sling system, so that when you're doing this stuff, like you have the structural stability and the structural integrity to be able to withstand the forces when you're throwing. But it's not throwing mechanics, right? That's kind of where my head is at. It's like, okay, well, why wouldn't I do it? Well, maybe there's more efficient ways to create structural stability, and then I should just practice throwing. Does that make sense?
I actually do the opposite on that. So I'm in the camp that something like an Indian club is good for throwing. I can emulate the mechanics very well to the point where I can release. Obviously, I can't release the club. I'll have to do a circular energy maneuver to get it back to the original place, but I can catch my energy much like a pitcher would catch their energy. So I'm doing most, like, let's say 85% of the movement. I even pulse at the right time to catch the elastic energy in the back. I pulse. I do pretty much as much of the maneuver as I can, exactly as throwing, and I can go in different planes of motion, right? And the fact that I can repeat it 100 times over is great as well. But the whole point is to kind of emulate the pattern so that I'm good at the pattern. And I don't see, like, if you were to try to say you're not integrating that pattern into you, I don't think that would be accurate. What would be accurate is you're not exactly integrating the pattern into you, but then you would have to do the pattern exactly, right? So it's the same thing with figure eights. Figure eight to me is a universal pattern. You may disagree with me. I think it is. Okay. So I work.
When you say figure eights, can you define that pattern? Because, like, a figure eight, I know that you're referring to it within the gait cycle and within certain joints, but what would you want to define figure eights as within a universal pattern? Like, how is it universal, and where does it show up in human movement?
It literally shows up everywhere. Like, I can't prove this, but basically, like, the way I see it is I use one marker if I want to make it super simple, and that's my sternum. And as I'm moving, that sternum is going to go in a small figure eight, and it may be just tiny if I'm only moving my head a little bit, right? But if as I'm moving, that's going to be in a figure eight. Now, I can take advantage of the energy that's coming from a certain section of the figure eight to turn my body with it. Okay. So, and this, I'm now talking multiple plane movement. So that's just an example of what I can do with thinking of patterns, right? So it's universal in that I'll train it with ropes, let's say, right? That's a very easy way to train basic figure eight patterns. I can watch the rope go in a figure eight next to me. Both sides of my body have to work at the same time. And I can see the result right in front of me. If I'm smooth, the rope is more smooth, right? So I can take that. I can put a basic spinal engine, whatever you want to call the fact that I'm trying to feel energy, be smooth from side to side and be balanced, push out of my feet, do the right maneuvers at the hips. I can, play with that a little bit. But for instance, when I was skiing the other day, just from the pattern alone, I felt the spinal engine for the first time. I've been skiing for 35 years. So I felt the spinal engine in skiing for the first time ever. And it's because I integrated these patterns so much in my brain that I can start doing them autopilot now. And that's what I'm looking for, behavior change over time. I'll throw out the language. I just want a better behavior at the end of the day that's going to get me more movement variability while still staying in the right principles.
Right. And that's like, I've noticed that as well. You taught me basic underhand figure eight patterns with the rope. And that was the first pattern that really locked in. I did some overhand patterns, but those overhand patterns didn't feel exactly as natural to me. And go figure, when we're looking at locomotion, the shoulders do an underhand figure eight pattern. And so I did this underhand figure eight pattern like a gazillion times. Like, I would just, go out for a half an hour and just do this. You get into this nice little rhythm, this nice little meditation. And it's the repetition of the behavior that ingrains it in your nervous system pattern. And then when I was walking, I was like, oh, my shoulders are doing this figure eight pattern without me trying, whereas when you first started teaching me some stuff about locomotion, like the head over foot, it was like really a lateral bend for me. And it was kind of blocky and awkward, versus when I was doing this pattern over and over, my nervous system learned to create a figure eight rather than just a lateral bend, or just bending at the spine. It was like really ingrained in my nervous system. And that's sort of this question of like, okay, can you just train behaviors and patterns, right? Do I need the rope? Can I just practice over and over again and just roll my shoulders in different patterns and ingrain that into my nervous system? Would I learn it faster? I liked the rope because it had so much kinesthetic feedback, but the question, the question, and I'm playing devil's advocate just for fun, right? Is like, okay, well, is using an external implement, the resistance from this motion that I'm getting from the rope, is that the true pattern that's going to show up in locomotion? Or is that a pattern that's going to exclusively exist when I am when I'm using a rope? Is my body responding to this external force? The same way that my body responds to an external force when I'm squatting, for example, doesn't translate well to my gait. am I like screwing my nervous system inputs for locomotion by having an external resistance object that is teaching my brain to rotate in a certain way? So when, is the force curve the same in locomotion when I'm running or I'm sprinting with the rope as it is, like, yes, it is a universal pattern, but is the way that my body is adapting to using this tool, is it teaching my body to, overutilize certain muscles or overcompensate in certain ways?
It's definitely a possibility, right? Like there's better ways to do things than others, right? You can definitely rope incorrectly. And I'd say most people don't integrate their whole body into it. So that alone right there is what you're talking about. So I think you really do need to know what you're doing in order to maximize the benefit, but it's not that hard, right? Like you get the basic, I would say go to footwork where you're on the outside edge, ankle bone high, whatever, right? Back in your hips, front or back chain dominant, and you're working those patterns back and forth and actually feeling, this is key, actually feeling the energy transfer to the rope through your body. When I started roping, I was a block. Like I couldn't transfer the energy properly, right? So it looked just blocky and the rope would fly. Now it's like you can see the energy going through the body and it's very smooth. Now the next level is doing it in a actual walk without having to have my body tense at all. You want it relaxed. I should be able to walk like I walk down the street in a good pattern and just rope. Boom.
Well, it's funny because I was having a conversation with a guy named Pablo Lagasse who makes his own ropes. He studied with David Weck a little bit, and he said, I can help you with some of the sneaks that you're trying to learn. I was trying to learn the overhand sneak, which is a pattern that David Weck chooses, and I said, the hard thing that I have is my limitation feels like internal shoulder rotation. And he laughed at me. He's like, don't think in those terms. It's all in your brain. You just have to do more reps and learn to talk to your body. And I said, so is what you're saying is like, I just need to develop more kinesthetic awareness, like thinking of the rope as an extension of my body. And that's kind of what he was getting at. It's like, once you learn to develop that awareness of how those forces transfer from your body to the rope, and you're keeping those forces smoother and smoother, it's more of a feeling based thing than like, I got this shoulder internal rotation because I was doing all this, internal rotation stretch, and now I can access that behind my back position. It's, for him, it's like, it doesn't matter how internally rotated you can get your shoulder, as long as you know what the rope is doing in relation to how far you're peeling that back. Go ahead.
This is interesting because I watched your video, and after you said, like, from what you said, what's his name?
His name is Pablo Lagasse.
Okay, so what Pablo said to you, it's basically it's true to a certain extent, but if you don't have the internal rotation, you probably shouldn't do it because you're forcing it there. Now, when I watched your video, you weren't rotating from the hip or the thoracic spine in the right sequence, so your timing was off, right? So there you would have had to use a lot of internal shoulder rotation to actually pull the maneuver off. Where if you were more sequenced, and that's why I don't teach overhead patterns. Like that's a pretty difficult pattern to begin doing, especially if you don't have the sequencing. So basically you were missing the turn of your hips and the turn of your thoracic spine at the right time. So yeah, your demands on your internal shoulder rotation are going to be high, and it could lead to injury, right?
Well, this is the whole question of like, at what point is that going to like that sequencing? What's that going to transfer over? Is that going to make me better at roping only, or is that going to make me better at other stuff as well?
Well, the overhand pattern is like, I'll show you, I'll do a video on this. Actually, it's an overhead pattern is exactly my overhead right for boxing, like literally exactly. Okay. So you don't really need overhead for anything but throwing, grasping, and you don't need it for locomotion. So it's not the most important pattern out there, but you can use it for a lot of variability in your movement, a lot of lateral motions, having your momentum go with you. So it is useful in a higher level, right? But in a lower level, I would learn the underhand sneaks first. The underhand sneaks are very useful because it transfers right over into gait. And you have those, you're actually reaching back like you would in a run when you're doing it. Like I'm literally doing that. An underhand sneak is like you're doing basically the running pattern. So there's a lot of movements that are very like your hips are back, they're rotating, they're spilling over. It's the heel out energy. It's the basic same pattern as running, but you can play with WEC type maneuvers with your arms too once you get used to it. Okay, so you can think of different parts of your body. You can lead with those. You can emulate the patterns of locomotion with underhand, but overhead's a less effective pattern, in my opinion.
Yeah. So that's, well, and I like the distinction that David Weck makes actually between fight and flight patterns, right? So when you're describing, okay, well, this is my overhand hook, like my overhand punch. It's like, okay, well, doing an overhand pattern is training with fight mechanics. Training underhand is training with flight mechanics. They're both relevant, right? Like martial mechanics are still relevant to functional fitness, I think. For grappling, for grasping, for punching and striking. Like these are all relevant things, maybe just not for locomotion, right? And I think that was one thing that I sort of started changing my mind a little bit more about in terms of quote functional biomechanics. Was it's like I was thinking purely ancestrally in terms of what a hunter gatherer human would do versus hunter gatherers and tribal humans still fought each other as well, right? So it wasn't just throwing. Yeah, throwing a rock at someone's head is probably a more efficient way to knock them out than punching him at the end of the day, right? But is the throw mechanic the same as the locomotion mechanic, or is it the same as a striking mechanic?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of commonalities, but they're not the same. They end at some point, right? Again, like
Yeah.
a lot of striking mechanics are overhand. Not all of them, but a lot of them are overhand. It's and usually you're on one side. You're turned to the side, right? So it's not exactly a locomotion mechanic. But boxing and striking is a lot like being nimble in a small area, right? Very useful for a lot of things. Like we're not just robotic walking forward creatures. In fact, my demands here on a daily basis, I'm walking on the side of steep mountains all the time. And I found that even like if I do a 360 as I have momentum going down, it's not scary to me. It actually slows me down and puts me in control. So that's just one like I don't do it on purpose, or I do it on purpose. And obviously you're not going to use it except if you're, falling off something, but it is actually very useful in my day to day. It's not just straight walking on cement or walking on a flat plane straight that you need, right? So yeah, at some point I think you do need to train patterns. It's just a question of when, right?
And well, like I saw a video of this guy named Taylor Starch. I think I sent you the video. He's really big into all kinds of stuff. He's a distance runner, very into FRC, and he had this video of him like really leaning, like bending his ankles super 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 hard, and basically walking on his inside and outside ankles, and then switching feet. And he's like, "Oh, I'm conditioning my ankles for these hyper steep side slopes that I have to run across and on." And that's training specificity. But like, is it though? Like, is folding over onto your ankles and walking onto your ankles, is that making it more durable for what's you're shaking your head? What's your take on that?
I run sideways all the time and I run the same. It's the same principles. It may be useful in a range of motion context if you've had an ankle sprain and your ligaments really tight and you feel that right away as soon as you rock a little bit. Then yeah, you need a little bit of that range of motion, but I wouldn't train it like that. That to me, the model is more range of motion. Your body will figure it out, and now you have more capacity. You can roll your ankle a little bit more. But to me, it's like, no, get in the right patterns and you won't roll your ankle in the first place, or it'll be less likely, right? So I'm more along the lines of that camp. I do think he's doing detrimental things to his gait pattern while trying to achieve range of motion.
So why is that detrimental to his gait pattern?
Because you're gonna have floppy ankles, like if you're training them like that.
Okay, but the question is, are you? So this is something that I've been thinking about because I did a lot of work with Lucas Aaron in range of strength, and I've been doing some more of his stuff specifically. for my shoulder and for a little bit of my lower body mechanics to get better on the ground. And the question that I have is like, okay, like I'm doing this end range work, and yeah, it's stretching, quote unquote. He does do some passive flexibility stuff, but you are actually developing like structural strength in these end ranges. Like you're still developing tissue, you're still developing control in these issues, or the ranges. And like, does that, you know, will that make you floppy? I don't necessarily think so. Like, I still think that he would have, like, in the Taylor Starch example, and I'll actually pull up the video here, of what he was doing. In the example that he had here, where he's, it's funny watching it. It's actually a lot more obscene than I remember it.
Yeah, let's
So
check it
yeah,
out.
I'm gonna pull this up. He's holding a weight, and he's like
Oh
really,
yeah.
really reefing on the inside and
Yeah.
outside. And you're saying this is going to make his ankles floppy, but like, wouldn't the adaptation necessarily, because of he's placing load on it over time, wouldn't it have more structural integrity because it's adapting to the load? Or do you think that's like just not true at all?
Yeah, like maybe the tendon or the ligaments will get thicker. That's a
Hmm.
possibility for sure. Is it going to stop him from rolling over? Is this a proprioceptive way to train? Yeah, maybe a little bit, right? Um, I, you know what? I wouldn't do it exactly like this, but I don't mind a little bit of this just to get your tissues conditioned. And I'm talking like
Right.
I'll do 1 minute a day. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
it depends how much you would do it. Would be like if you're training as a theory that getting more range of motion, which FRC does this, right? Getting more
Yeah.
range of motion is beneficial, and they want to control that range of motion, but they control it mostly in an open chain, okay? Not a closed chain environment, not definitely not a movement environment, okay?
Mm.
They're
I,
always
you know,
still. So like, you know what? I do a little bit of this. I don't completely hate it. I just wouldn't train it all the time.
Right. So his core thesis, if I was going to sum it up into the one sentence, is that your muscles simply speak force and energetics and respond to the demands placed upon them. Right. So your muscles and joints don't know what repetitions are. Your muscles and joints don't know what the word neutral means. Your muscles and joints don't know whether you're using a barbell, kettlebell, dumbbell, or body weight. I would say that they do personally. Your
Yeah,
muscles and joints have no awareness of good and bad. Your
that's
muscles and
like
joints
inaccurate.
simply, well, I mean,
Yeah,
they obviously do know the difference between good and bad, because you have pain
yeah.
signals. If you're in a quote bad position, it's going to compromise you. But I do agree that your muscles and joints do speak force and energetics and respond to the demands placed upon them. So he's like, did my ankle know that I was trail running down a mountain when it went into end range pronation? Or did it simply think it was my Tuesday ankle mobility session? Like that's his main thing. He's like, I want my body to not know the difference between whether I'm running. But the thing is, like, actually, Dr. Brandon Kilman made a point about how the forces that are placed on you when you're running are like hundreds of times more. Like, yes, he is using weight and he's loading himself, he's doing loaded mobility here, but the actual force that's produced when he steps and he pounds into the ground there is so much higher than the force he's producing when he's taking like little steps in this extreme end range pronation, right? It's
Um,
not the same stimulus.
I agree with that. And in also with force and energetics, you have joint receptors, which you didn't talk about,
Mhm.
right? Maybe
Right.
energetics has that, but joint receptors are quick, right? So you have stretch reflexes in your fascia. So basically, if you roll an ankle, let's say you roll over, your body sends a signal from the fascia or the joint up to the spinal cord, back down to the joint. And you have that split second to get off that. So
Mm.
if you weight it and put all the pressure in and your ankle's rolled over, snap, there goes the ligament, right? It's not always I have the range of motion. It's your signal didn't get there quick enough,
Right.
right? So he's missing that. He's also missing the fact that like he's just talking about the ankle here. In that photo, his tibia is already spun in the
Mm.
like in the wrong direction. You know what I mean? It's already collapsed. So, I mean, yeah, you can say that right there is a proof that so the pitcher is proof that he needed this range of motion because it shows up in the running. And this is a good example of what a still picture can be misinterpreted is, did you actually need to perform this exercise to make your ankle look like that?
Right.
Or could, you know what I mean? It means actually not much other than
And did your ankle need to look
internal.
like that in the context of your run? If you didn't have that range of motion, would your ankle, like, could you have trained your ankle to have more structural stability to resist the forces? And like when you're running along the side of a mountain, for example, how much structural integrity, like my ankle doesn't fully collapse and pronate even when I'm running up on the side of a hill. Like it still maintains a little bit of like that, that quote inside ankle bone climbing behavior, even though my foot might be on the slope, my ankle bone is still fighting to climb up and maintain its structural integrity. I don't know about you, but like that's been my experience after training it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And just looking from in this picture, what he's doing, there's no thought of spinal engine. There's no thought of anything but the ankle, right? And the body just doesn't work like that. It's an energetic wave. It's a sequence of maneuvers, right? So I don't think he's going to, when the going gets tough and he hits a rock, is this training going to stop that ankle or increase the signal effectiveness to the spinal cord back to his ankle in order to disassociate his leg quick enough? Or is it just going to roll over and the signal's not going to be there and then he's just going to roll it over further? I don't know. Like,
yeah, it's hard.
I
guess it is.
I wouldn't train like this. 1 minute a day just to feel it out, get those tissues ready, and that's it.
Right. And, like, again, this is like we talked really early when we started the podcast. We talked about how ATG's system, for example, is using linear patterns to build thicker tissues with the hopes that it can resist rotational forces. Right. That was even, when we interviewed Keegan Smith, he even said it's like, the biomechanics thing, you're just dancing around. It doesn't really make too much of a difference. You got to condition the tissues. A thicker rope is a thicker rope. If you have a thicker cable, it's not going to snap. But, to the point of the forces that show up when you're running or jumping or cutting are hundreds of times more than you can load in a slow controlled environment, like hundreds of times. And that's for me, that was my aha moment where it's like, okay, even if I'm squatting like hundreds and hundreds of pounds, like how durable is first of all, I have to foam roll. I made a meme this morning about like how you have to like do mobility work for half an hour and foam roll for 20 minutes before you can squat these heavy weights. So it's like, okay, I have to do all this warming up before I can even do this movement pattern. So how functional or how mobile am I actually becoming from doing it? But the fact is, like, I can't actually emulate the forces that's put on my body during a run or during a cut using a barbell, using dumbbells, using these external implements necessarily. Now, I think a guy like Naudi Aguilar is trying to produce. He'll use his multiplane trainer and like the parabar, for example, to try and produce force along fascial lines where force is supposed to be transferred, and so he'll create these lines of tension so that the body knows how to at least coordinate itself, so that when you do implement the actual force, the dynamic force of, say, running or throwing, then your body at least knows how to sequence itself or stay connected along these fascial lines. And that's different than saying, okay, well, I'm going to condition my tissues to resist the forces without actually, training the forces or the patterns directly. The question is, do you think that, using, sometimes I'll look at the parabar and I'll look at the multiplane trainer and some of the spinning moves that they do, and I have a hard time imagining how it equates to the reality. Like they have the functional patterns has an ad, right? And they use yoga. They're like, this movement reality, and it shows a bunch of yogis like doing their thing, and the warriors like is not the same as this movement reality, and it's the sprinter just booking it down a track, I think, or like a football player running or sprinting. But then you look at some of the behavior patterns that functional patterns, does with their multiplane trainer, and you're like, that doesn't look like the gait cycle either. It doesn't look like the same movement reality. It looks like you're optimizing for using the multiplane trainer. So what's your take on that? Do you think that there can be transfer there? Do you think that you can improve your patterns without directly training the patterns, but training the fascial lines? What's your hot take on that?
I have the same experience with you on that. Like, I've played around with it quite a bit. I know it's not the same because he has a patented one which allows you to, turn and have like an effective resistance, I guess you can say.
Yeah.
I just don't see how the force vectors match, because he talks about force vectors, right? So I don't know how they match the gait cycle. Like, if I have an external resistance in my hand and I'm pushing it forward, like, that doesn't match the gait cycle. However, I know he's not completely trying to do that. He's trying to chamber sequence. So basically get your fascial lines to integrate together. And I think he has an element of stability in there, because when they go together, they have to be stable, right? So he's stabilizing with the fascial lines together and then moving through space. Now, is that the way I would do it? Maybe, maybe not, right?
Well, we kind of talked about this in a message conversation. Is there a difference between dynamic stability and just like static stability? So when people are like, oh, I'm doing stability training, maybe they're thinking about balancing on the wrong side of the Bosu ball, or using like a balance trainer and trying to like make sure that their ankle stabilizes under an unstable, like it's unstable surface training. So you're doing all these regular movements on an unstable surface versus when you're trying to resist lateral forces when you're running, that requires dynamic stability. Devin from One of a Kind Fitness talks about that. You need to laterally stabilize, and you need to have a stable lumbopelvic hip complex, which is the ability to resist lateral forces and these forces that are happening from multiple directions. You can stabilize and return to the center, and that's a dynamic stability, right? So are you creating a sense of dynamic stability when you're using these multiplane trainers? Like the one thing that I could see it being limited on is like you are stabilizing yourself through rotational movement and multiplane movements, because you have to brace and you have to activate muscles, right? You still have to stretch and release, and you have to activate these fascial lines in order to resist and stabilize against these forces. However, it feels very concentric, right? You don't have that same deceleration or elasticity sort of quality that maybe the viscoelastic property is trained with different things, like the mace, like the clubs, like the throws, which they still have a lot of in functional patterns. Like they use a lot of implements that can take advantage of and even train the elastic quality. But I just don't like, I see the multiplane trainer and even the parabar being a very concentric dominant thing that won't actually emulate the force curve of something that requires dynamic stability.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't use the concentric eccentric model as much, because I know he's trying to, you'll think of it concentrically, but then he'll spin, right? So was that eccentric before he spun? Do you get what I'm saying? It's like, it is dynamic. Yeah. I think you can't use the words eccentric and concentric when you're in motion. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it doesn't work. That's goes to the thought of my post the other day about the fascia and the muscle, right? The muscle's contracting and the fascia is moving according to how you're moving, right? So basically, for me at the end, I want to emulate the behaviors that I want to do. And I can use the parabar as a tool to feel things. That's the value that I found in it. So I'm going to talk about my personal experience. I found getting into certain positions, even like a bow, and just feeling out the parabar above my head and trying to feel basically my rib cage get bigger and more expanded, and just feel that out. And that's almost like a flowability concept, right?
Yeah. So don't let anyone, don't let functional patterns guys or GOTA guys know that you were combining their systems and then combining it with flowability too. They're going to get pissed off. No.
Well, this was actually like before I even knew about GOTA. I was spent like 2 years messing around with force vectors, like force, basically bands. If you ever seen the industrial, or what's it called? Industria band or something like that, where you put it around your shoulder and you twist your body and the band is unwrapping you in one direction. I did 1 million of those out in the forest, like 2 hours a day, like trying to figure this out, right? And it didn't work at the end. Maybe I just didn't figure it out, right? But when I found GOTA, I was like, and WEC, I was like, okay, this makes a lot more sense intuitively to me than trying to wrap myself up in a band and figure out which way the force is going and what muscles are firing and things like that, right? Where I'm just like getting a bow. Oh, I didn't get my bow today, right? Like I slow mode myself and I don't look very good. Well, let's work on that, you know? That
100%.
had a lot more fruit for me.
Yeah, and so this is the question of like, all right, here are the behaviors that show up in the movements that we want to have. Is it enough to just train the behaviors over and over and over again? So prior to this episode, I made a post about it. I kind of pre-announced what the subject of what we were going to be talking about was, and the comments section was kind of interesting. One person asked, does training fractals, as in like when I say fractals, I mean smaller segments of the whole movement. So if you talk about like a bow being set in your leg, it's the femur that starts from more neutral or internal rotation, goes out. To me, that's a bowing action. You can train a fractal of that internal to external rotation without having to have the whole body move into it. So just training fractals actually create long-term changes. I'm able to do exercises such as the go to bow and hinge to perfection and for many reps, but the movement is not translated to my athletic movement yet. I'm wondering if doing more extreme forms of mobility and stretching might have better transfer. And this is a really interesting thing. First of all, it's hard to say if he's actually, quote, doing them perfectly. Like, are you actually doing a go to bow and hinge to perfection? I thought I was, until I hired Eric Tessie to give me an assessment and show me actually how to do some of the movements. And I realized, okay, I had no idea what the fuck I was actually doing. It's actually a lot more nuanced, and actually training the fractals of these bows and corners is actually much more nuanced. Now, after a week of doing it that way, did my gait mechanics improve? I'm not entirely sure. This is the question though. Can you just train the fractals of movement and have it translate to better movement? Or do you need a stronger neurological input of some sort of external cue, not even an external cue, but some sort of more extreme intervention to lock it into your nervous system? What do you think?
I think both can be correct. Don't forget that a bow is just a snapshot in time. It's not, it's a picture in time, and it's an easy way to parse things out. For me, it's like, if I can land in that structure, like if my hip can look like a bow, then I'm doing well. And it's an easy way for me to see if I'm landing correctly. Are there other elements that are important? Absolutely, right? So it's not the only element. And I do think you have to start using it in actual motion as soon as possible in order to put it into motion, right? Like you do need reps in actual motion. Now, the question is, a lot of people are like, well, those are skills, so you just do it during skill practice, right? Or that's not really, you just do the actual mechanics and you work that, and then that'll transfer into the motions. And it may do that. But I do think that you have to pattern in, like the way I do it is I pattern in exactly what I want to see. So I'll pattern in a overhead motion of my pelvis. Okay. And I don't think I've seen other people do this, but I'm going to let you know what I do in terms of how I think about it. I pattern in the overhead motion of my pelvis. And I didn't say this before because I don't really have it down. I also pattern how to twist it, right? Counter rotations of my upper body and lower body, how to twist it with my hips back. And that's my practice at my hip for 360 motions. Okay. I want to be able to.
When you say you practice that actual, like that overhand, it's, again, we're talking about a figure eight pattern. The shoulders do the underhand figure eight and the hips do the overhand figure eight. It's that counter rotation that creates the spinal movement for the spinal engine. So we were talking about how you pattern that underhand figure eight with the rope. How are you patterning what drills, or how are you specifically patterning in that overhand figure eight in the hips?
If you watch my story yesterday on where I was doing the bow staffing, that's what my intention was, is to make my hips go overhand smoothly. And that transferred, like I was thinking pulse there, transfers into my hand. My hand was loose, right? So I'm practicing that pattern and I want it to go over perfectly in a circle, right? And then I just repeat, go from side to side. I do like basically just an overhand motion. If I'm dancing, I literally learned this off a dancer. I push my hips over like this as I'm standing there. My hips are way back. I work that pattern. I can work it with one foot off, right? I do those circular motions. So when I walk, it's exactly what I want. I want that fluidity in there, and I want it to be able to be fluid. And at the same time, like if I'm running, I can flip that hip and just turn the other direction real fast, right? So it's like I'm using basic figure eight patterns. I don't know if I have this completely down where I can talk more than that about it, right? I'm still experimenting with it.
Now, when you're practicing that pattern, where is the like? So this is an interesting concept. I've talked to Devin Brown quite a few times from One of a Kind Fitness about this idea of stabilizing the lumbo-pelvic hip complex, and he's still, concedes to the fact that you're still getting this overhand rotation. Do you think about the sort of coupling of your lumbar spine with your hips as you're doing it? Are you conscientious of where that rotation and that figure eight is coming from?
Of course, or is it that's literally what I do on my meditative walks. Is I try to I feel what's there and how it's behaving, and I'll put it into my conscious control for a while and play with it. And then I'll forget about it for a bit and I'll play with something else, right? So for me, it's just like, I feel like I get strawmanned on this sometimes because it's like, well, you can't think about your head being over your foot. Yeah, I know. Like, I'm not saying I'm thinking about it 24 hours a day. I put it in my conscious control just like anything else for a bit. I emulate the behavior I want, and then it burns into your nervous system. Like, how does that not work? Tell me how that wouldn't work.
So again, this is when you're talking about being strawmanned and people saying, you shouldn't just cue head over foot. I think the argument is that if you're just cueing that, you might do it in a suboptimal way. And I kind of talked about alluding to the fact that when I started doing it, rather than getting that nice figure eight and that counter rotation that happens naturally in the gait cycle, I'm a lifter, or was a lifter. I was robo lateral bending. That's why I even, like the meme that I made the other day where, lifters think that the spinal engine is Jefferson curls and lateral bending. That was poking fun. It was poking fun at myself because I used to think that, right? And so when I started practicing head over foot, I would flex my lat, I would flex my lat and, try to keep my head straight. And I'm doing this like tilt to the side thing to do head over foot when it's actually this kind of like smoother motion, right? So the cue, I think the argument against should you cue the behavior is that, like, when I was doing go to drop-ins and setting a bow, my hip was laterally shifting and I wasn't loading the proper angles, and I wasn't actually creating the behavior of that femur rotation that has to happen in order for you to actually set and release the energy in the bow. So training the behavior is great if you're training the right behavior. There is some structural stability and some like behavioral specificity that you need to do to drill it for it to become unconscious in a functional way, in a way that's not going to screw up your patterns and create compensatory behaviors in other ways, right? And so that's, like I was doing go to bows for probably 4 months and then had to spend another 2 months undoing the patterning that I created from doing improper, lateral shifting go to bows where I was loading the wrong part of my body and not actually creating the proper femur rotation.
Yeah, like I agree. You should do the correct sequence, right? Like, I don't think GOTA says to dump your hip out laterally. Whose fault is that? Like, you're not hiring a GOTA coach and you're trying to do GOTA, right? Like, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm saying that GOTA's system says to go into the hip, not dump the knee out or anything like that, right? It may be a cue that they use at times. I don't know. I shouldn't speak for GOTA, but basically, you have to do everything correctly. Even if it's pattern work, it has to be done. Like, the better patterns you put in, the more smooth they are, the more they sync together. That's what you're looking for. At the end of the day, we all want smooth movement, right? It's just the question of, can you put the patterns in and have them replicate in real life? And to me, it has been working, so I'm going to keep doing it.
Well, and I agree, right? Like, there are different approaches where it's like, well, you can train using implements or train using different stimuli to create the structural integrity. that might be lacking from poor behaviors that occurred over time. And you might want to even train, beyond what your genetic preset was, or beyond what your behavioral preset was. On that post that I made, I had one of the comments I really liked was Jameson DeLalo. He said, in general, most of us should first master this body bag that we were born into and learn to optimize the patterns we observe in some of the best movers in order to live pain-free and enjoy movements for this lifetime. Now, I agree with one-of-a-kind fitness that both can be integrated with one another. I find that generally I use tools for clients that have had a joint replacement, recent injury, or those that are just really out of tune with their bodies. So again, it's this example of like, if you have a pre-existing injury or you have something that like proprioceptively, it's very difficult for them to just use their body and just use that downward pull of gravity for them to create these proper joint angles. Using an external object can improve proprioceptive awareness to create that sort of neurological awareness or kinesthetic awareness of their body. And so he's using that as the example. He goes on and he's like, obviously, there's a small majority of us that just like to explore movement and play with different tools to see if they really translate to better movement. I'm personally at a point where I am just further trying to optimize my own patterns without external devices and tools. We also have to be aware that there are many gimmicks in the fitness industry that don't have any crossover to optimizing movement that are just being marketed as tools. I thought that was a pretty balanced answer, to be honest.
And that's a philosophy. I can't really argue with that. If that's the way you want to train, you can absolutely train without external implements, right? Like, why not have your own body do the work? That's fine. For me, I like the variation of tools. I love the bow staff, by the way. Like, I'm getting back into that, but that's more like a spear, right? It literally feels like when I'm walking through the forest here, I'm walking through the forest. I'm not on trails all the time. There's like animals everywhere. I feel more secure with the spear. So I'm running through the forest. It's hilarious, man. I'm running through the forest, no shoes, spear in my hand. I wouldn't know what to do if a bear's coming at me, right? But
full caveman
awesome
mode.
Yeah.
That's amazing,
awesome.
man. It's and like the other thing is too, like, I feel like some, whether or not it's optimal for your gait pattern, like I don't do the ropes necessarily. Like I love the rope to learn that oscillating figure eight pattern. Now I just do it for fun because it's kind of meditative and it's a satisfying, fun way to move. And it just helps get into a flow state. It feels more like play. And I think play is still an element that we need in our movement practice. I loved our conversation with Charlie Daist, where one of the MoveNat fundamentals that he kind of talked about in his philosophy was this idea of having games and playfulness as an integral part of your movement practice, and not to be so clinical and over the top analytical about every little fractal element of how you're moving. Because the other thing is, if you're thinking about your movement all the time, you're not moving fluidly. Realistically, the more you have to think about your movement, the less you're moving naturally, right? And I think the point, like I'm guilty of this too, because I come from the gym mindset where I was exercising for exercise's sake. I would go to the gym, I would lift weights with the goal of lifting heavier and more weights over time. That was the only goal that I had. I didn't have a movement goal. Now, without, like I want to run more fluidly, I want to run smoother, I want to run my friend Tyler is dragging me into this 50-kilometer run, and I've never done anything like it. It's like, okay, well, I want my mechanics to be on fucking point as I'm running through this trail for 50 fucking kilometers. I want to be secure, and I want to, I want it to feel good and efficient. That's a specific goal. But then beyond that, it's like, well, what are my movement goals? It's like, I don't really have one, so I'm just going to play with a rope. It's fun. Totally. I spent 2 hours doing recode work and lumbo-pelvic hip complex stabilization and gait patterning, and then walking with the proper femur and ankle control. Like, I want to actually just move. I want to enjoy movement, and I don't want it to be this like stressful thing that I'm over analyzing all the fucking time.
I look at it kind of like seasons. Sometimes I'll overanalyze, really think about something, hone in on it, with my conscious, or even during the day. It might be earlier in the day. There might be a micro point of that, right? Where I hone in on something consciously, and then at the end of the day, it flows, right? I go a lot by feel. It's not very like in my personal practice, it's not very structured, but I feel like I'm at the point where I need to do that because
Right.
that's how it works for me. Yeah.
Well, and again, like if you overcompensate in one direction, I find people have a tendency to overcompensate in the other direction before finding the middle ground. I know that's how I've worked in my life, where it's like I went from like I'm just powerlifting to I'm just doing yoga, or like I'm just doing Ido Portal. And then eventually I got to this point where it's like, oh, like I can probably do a little bit of everything. And again, purists don't like that. People who are like, well, just do Goda and run and just do this, and it's like, okay, well, sorry, I can't. Like that's not how my system operates. I really loved what Caesar from Stillness Academy, by the way, just since we're
Yeah.
kind of on the topic of tools, I just wanted to read his comment too. He said the body is the first training tool, but it's designed for use with and in response to a dynamic environment. The fluid atmosphere, gravity, the earth sandwiched in between, and a bunch of things that we find on the earth, like rocks, trees, water, other animals, etc. One of the things that distinguishes our species is our enhanced capacity for tool use. To completely ignore that and train entirely without incorporating the environment slash tools, as if we evolved in a lab or something, that seems against our nature. Patterns be damned. I'd imagine that most people will incorporate at least some tools, which could lead us to other questions like which tools are best for blank, and when do we use those tools, and how. And I really, really like that perspective because again, it's like it's a balanced observation. It's also saying that like, okay, we didn't we shouldn't treat our movement practice like we're in a laboratory. Movement in the gait cycle doesn't happen in a vacuum or in isolation. We're also, our gait cycle happens in a dynamic environment. And this is funny because this is some of the issues that even with Goda, while I agree with a lot of their principles, you watch some tribes that are running on uneven surfaces, and you get, like the Taylor Starch thing. I don't necessarily agree with, where you're doing extreme pronation with a weight just because your foot bends while you're running on a slope, on a slant. But you're in a dynamic environment where your body has multiple different demands and multiple different inputs, and it should be ready for a bunch of different things. And training just these fractals of this one pattern that shows up, it's like, yeah, they're universal patterns, but they also don't happen in a vacuum. That's sort of my observation of that.
Yeah, I really like that, and I really like what Stillness said there. I think that you can go both ways. I don't think there's a wrong way to do this. I think at certain times you can use tools. They're valuable for certain maneuvers that you want to put in. Now, do I get a person who's just starting out to use tools? Probably not. There's so much low-hanging fruit with just your body. But it also depends. If a person wants to do ropes or something like that, I'm not going to stop them because it's positive movement, right? So
Right.
there's a balance there that you have to play with. And what is a person willing to do? Where do they come from? What's their history? Do they have limitations? Are they stoked to do it? And there's teaching the body the basic fundamentals at the same time, right? So there's a lot of elements in there that can switch your training.
And I will also say, like, I sometimes would give a beginner an external implement to increase proprioceptive awareness. And the rope, for example, was something that, even though I was kind of being turned on to more locomotive patterns, the rope is what taught me that underhand pattern. It's sort of what started to drill me out of just this either rotation or lateral bending. It taught me to actually combine that and become more fluid in my movements. So it's like, that is the most simple thing in the world to teach me, but it had such a huge effect on my movement. It was really, really, really powerful. Simon Benoit, he's saying he uses the rope as an assessment tool, and I find that's really interesting because I've never heard someone using the rope as an assessment. But I guess the ability to coordinate and use, like, Simon, what are you using the rope as an assessment for? Like, I would assume it's fluidity and the ability to articulate through the spine, or even counter rotate, or even just have like general kinesthetic awareness. That would be kind of interesting. He's saying you can see thoracic rotation preferences. That's interesting. That's super interesting.
That is interesting. I would think there's a learning element to it, though. Like, at first, when somebody grabs a rope, they have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
So I would almost use it as assessment like a week into it or something like that. But that's just off the top of
Or
my head.
you
Right?
teach them how to do, or like if you're like, all right, this is what I want you to do. You're trying to get them to, because people have mirror neurons and they're still able to um, sort of like see what you're doing, and you can get them to, like, I was trying to teach my friend how to rope, and he just could not get it. It was really really funny, and I was trying, would stand in front of him, and we would do this like almost like mirrored dance thing, and then I put the rope in his hands, and he just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
It was really really funny. But
Some people need some time alone with that, just because
yeah,
it's a little bit embarrassing. Like the rope is flying, you're hitting it off things, like it tangles up. You just need some time on your own to figure it out. But
I mean, I smacked myself in the nuts probably 10 times last night just trying to just trying to learn the overhand sneak. It was really
yeah,
it was
learn the
brutal.
underhand sneak. I'm telling
I'm
you,
going to, yeah, I'm going to. It's just because I don't know, I was on the WEC Method website, and I literally was just on the thing, and I was looking at the overhand sneak, and
yeah.
I'll learn the underhand
I'll show you next time I
today.
see you there. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. But anyways, guys, I think this is a cool place to kind of wrap up, because we covered quite a bit of ground, and we've been already chatting for an hour, which is kind of crazy. Um, and on Thursday, like I said, we're actually going to get David Weck to kind of continue this conversation with us and talk about how he uses the tools that he actually invented to create a training effect, to create more efficient movement. And some of the tools that I'm really curious to talk to him about are the propulsors. So these 12-ounce shakers essentially that create feedback. I think a lot of what David Weck ends up doing is creating tools that create this extra kinesthetic feedback that help you sequence and coordinate and help the body move more as one total unit, which again, like, when we were talking about it, we kind of use the club as the reference for, it's like you can create this, like, this connection and this patterning for the throw, but is doing the force curve. Apparently, I can do the club with the same force curves as the throw, and you're gonna have to show me exactly how to do that, and I'm gonna have to practice it and learn it, because I'm really curious. But that we'll continue this conversation with David, and we can talk about his invention specifically. I think this was a really cool conversation, and one that we're going to keep having. What do you guys think? You can message me or message Will on Instagram. I am at The Body Moves. Will is at The Art of Move, and you can send us a message and share your perspective, because sometimes we'll read them out. If you have a subject that you want us to cover on the show, please send us a message as well, because sometimes we've had a lot of great messages with suggestions for guests to invite on, and I've reached out to a bunch of people who we've been suggested to get on as guests. But if there's a subject or a question or an element of biomechanics or movement or functional fitness, something that you want us to cover, please reach out to us and let us know. Any other final thoughts that you wanted to have from today? Anything that like kind of stood out to you that we didn't get to cover before we wrap up?
No, not really. I'm just really stoked for the WEC episode.
Yeah,
I've used all his products, have all his products, and I'm just excited to talk about the applications, double down pulse, pick his brain on a few things. So
yeah, I'm really really pumped too, because again, I got a set of propulsors. I've been using the ropes for a little while. I've never used his steps or anything, but who hasn't been on a Bosu ball at some point in their life, right? So,
sure.
anyways, guys, thank you so much for listening to The Art of Move. This Thursday rather, May 5th. David Weck will be joining us at 1:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. You can watch that live at nofilter.net. If you're listening on iTunes or Spotify, please leave us a rating. It really, really helps our visibility, and more people could be learning about functional fitness and cool movement stuff. So thanks so much for listening, guys. This was episode 53 of The Art of Move.
Nice,
53.
I believe so.
I do believe 53. That's kind of crazy. We're over the hump. We're more than halfway to 100 now. So, anyways, guys, we'll catch you Thursday. Thanks for listening, and thanks, Simon, for the cool feedback there and for being part of the conversation today. We'll talk to you later, guys.
Have a good one, guys. Bye.